Welcome students to week 2. Week 2 we are going to focus on the history of economic globalization, which is the aspect of globalization that most people refer to when they speak about globalization. We're going to look at 3 different narratives that describe that history, 3 different perspectives. We're going to look at Dr. Meyer's narrative, a narrative from the global north. We're going to look at Dr. Cheng's narrative, a narrative from the global east. And we're going to look at Dr. Galeano's narrative, a narrative from the global south. Now, of course, there are many more narratives besides these 3, but these 3 are fairly representative of their perspectives. So first of all, I want to talk about where they agree. There is a consensus, a general consensus on the positive impact of globalization. Although I need to say up front that the correlation is clear, the causation not quite so clear. So it's clear that globalization has a role in both the positive and negative impacts that I'm going to talk about. But it's not everyone is in agreement on exactly what the role of globalization is. So, what kind of positive impact have we seen economically in the globe that may be the result of globalization, but certainly is correlated with globalization? First of all, that we've seen over the last 200 years a massive reduction in chronic poverty, from 95% of the world to 22% of the world, although it is 43% in sub-Saharan Africa. Per capita wealth has increased over 7 times. Life expectancy has doubled. Over the past 25 years alone, child mortality has been cut in half, maternal mortality by 45%, malnutrition cut in half, and there is far more access to clean drinking water, sanitation, and mass education. On the other hand, there is some consensus on the negative impact, potentially, of globalization. Very clear evidence that there is increasing and extreme economic inequality, that there are global financial crises that can be directly attributed to global financial interconnection. There are ecological disasters. There is increasing dislocation, migration between countries, and internal dislocation within countries. We have the highest rate of forced migration that we have ever seen in the history of the planet. And while clearly people have increasing constructive power, people also have increasing destructive power. There is more oppression, exploitation, corruption, and lies. Now, in sharing this last phrase that you can see in front of you, I need to tell you a story. 30 years ago, I heard a presentation from the General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, the first Latin American General Secretary, Emilio Núñez, and he said that over the next 20 years, that the world will see increasing political democracy and increasing economic consolidation of power, or economic tyranny. So that, he said, people will see themselves as more free, but they will feel less free. And that will be a schizophrenic experience that will create deep anxiety. And in the midst of that anxiety, people will seek simplistic answers and be vulnerable to demagogues. And he said, false religion will obscure this reality and true religion will reveal it. Pretty powerful words, right? So I think to simply summarize what I believe is the truth in what he was saying, and what would be a general consensus about the truth, is that even though the average person in some ways has more agency than they ever have had, on the other hand, most people around the world feel relatively powerless with respect to economic decisions that impact their daily lives. And of course, not all their economic decisions, but key economic decisions. So how did we get here, both in terms of this positive and negative impact? Let's start with the view from the global north. So from 1400 to 1700, we have to actually start back that far. Dr. Mayos describes the age of exploration, where European maritime empires were created that controlled oceanic trade routes. So you had, as a result, you had political conquest, you also had alliances, you had the spread of diseases which devastated native populations, you had multinational trading companies grow up, and you had the international slave trade. It's interesting because you can see that some of these factors are terrible, right? But they're all encased in this description called the Age of Exploration, which is a sort of positive description. Starting more or less in 1820, you have the Industrial Revolution in Britain, in which capitalists, people who have access to capital, use their funds to build factories which create wealth by making production of goods more efficient, paying a fixed wage, and investing some of the profits in technological innovation, thus allowing them to create more efficient production and more wealth. At the same time, investors begin to share the risk by contributing their capital and sharing the profits. Markets are expanded through innovations in communication and transportation. So industrialization, transportation, and trade is ITT. And it's a little abbreviation that you should know. Now, Dr. Myers is very aware of some of the dark side of all of this, but he still is fundamentally excited about it. In fact, on page 80, he says this is something that God clearly created. That's a quote. Now, of course, going past World War II, you have some new developments in economic globalization from a global north perspective. Post-World War II, initially, you have the foundation of international monetary organizations. They are controlled by the biggest shareholder countries, and at that point, that's the United States and Britain. And these international monetary institutions loan money to countries devastated by World War II and to former colonies to produce development, economic development, and to combat communism. In 1980, you have another step in this process where the Washington Consensus decides to make these funds contingent on following the Western path of development, defined as open markets, unfettered open markets, no barriers to foreign capital entering, no barriers to trade, deregulation, reduced government support of health and social services, and democratic institutions. And there is a recognition in the Washington Consensus that when you reduce government support of health and social services, they called it the Big Bang, that it causes tremendous suffering. But the leaders of the Washington Consensus believed that in the end, it would cause so much benefit that it would be worth it. And of course, I just want to go back. I can't go back, but the little picture you saw was the rising tide lifts all boats. So I'm going to move to the second narrative, Dr. Cheng's narrative, the view from the global east. Dr. Cheng's narrative is that the path that the Western countries supposedly followed, that all the other countries of the world should copy, was not in fact the path that they followed. That he says that Britain protected its infant industries through tariffs and state support, forcing the colonies to not develop their own industries and to sell raw materials at cheap prices. And the U.S. protected its infant industries as well. And he actually goes into detail about other European powers besides the U.S. and Britain. He says that Western countries took decades to develop institutions that undergird development, often with reversals during the course of that time, and they were thus able to develop institutions that fit their culture. He says that the Asian path to development should include developing their own institutions that fit their culture, and that they should maintain health, education, and social services that create an effective workforce. The picture of the tiger is because a number of Asian countries have in fact followed Dr. Chang's model and were able to greatly increase their economic wealth and the economic wealth of their population to the point that they have been called the Asian tigers. When we talk about the improvements over the last 200 years, and particularly over the last 25 years, a huge factor in that global improvement has been China. And in China, 750 million people climbed out of extreme poverty. But they didn't do it through the recipe provided by the Washington Consensus. They did it through a pattern that was much closer to what Dr. Chang is describing in Kicking Away the Ladder. The view from the Global South that Dr. Galeano gives in some ways is very similar to the view that Dr. Chang gives. Dr. Galeano points out that the capital that allowed the capitalists to fund the Industrial Revolution came from the exploitation of the Global South. So it came from the slave trade, it came from the control of shipping lanes, it came from the military force behind the British trade companies, monopolies, and restriction of national industry, with low prices for raw material exports and high prices for manufactured exports. So let me just give you a couple examples of that. In India, the British Trade Company controlled all salt extraction. Indians were not legally allowed to extract salt. But then, of course, because people can't live without salt, they had to buy the salt back from Britain at higher prices than people paid in Britain, even though it came from their country. They were also forbidden to make cloth. They could just give the raw materials for textiles. They couldn't make their own clothing. And if you remember, if you know anything about Gandhi, Gandhi led a salt march to the sea, where 30,000 Indians began to collect their own salt from the sea. So that was an act of civil disobedience. He also got people to use spinning wheels all over the country, which was also an act of civil disobedience. They were going up against the laws that would have kept them from creating their own industry. So Dr. Galeano is very aware of the injustice of these actions, that the Industrial Revolution didn't just happen. It happened using the capital that had been taken from the Global South. And of course, it's a dynamic, right? It's an interdynamic. Dr. Galeano also talks, and more in not the chapter you read, but the chapter after that. But so if you want to keep reading it, you can. But he talks about how even after industrialization began in Latin America, that it was still largely controlled by foreign investors whose greater financial and military power allowed them to kill infant industries, to control their satellites, paying lower wages and benefits, and to keep national companies out of more profitable industries. He also talks about loans going to elites who then squander the money instead of paying it back, which then forces cuts in education and social programs. And he notes that those elites are often put in place politically and kept in place with military intervention and financial pressure from the United States and other European countries. And there is a long history of invasions, actually, of different Latin American countries by the U.S. when those Latin American countries wanted to get rid of the elites who were using the loans for their own luxury lifestyles and not paying them back, and increasing the poverty of the countries. So you can see three very different narratives here. Read the materials, decide what you think. Now, this conversation about the history of economic globalization would not be complete if we only paid attention to what the private sector and the public sector have done. Public sector is government, private sector is commercial. There is a third sector, which is usually referred to internationally as civil society. That is the sector of voluntary association. So the church is part of civil society, but all kinds of nonprofits are also part of civil society. So nonprofits have been profoundly engaged in development since the end of World War II. There is a network of nonprofit or NGO, non-governmental organization, if you want to use the international term. There's a network of development agencies that are focused on holistic development and the building of individual and community agency. And the development picture around the world would be very different without the work of those agencies. Those agencies also engage in international advocacy for fair trade relationships, arrangements, and policies. They also engage in advocacy in the global north for foreign aid that goes through public-private partnerships. There is also civil society, of course, that is not international, that is really in and from the global south. We often refer to it as people's movements, and those have also had a role both in development and in holding development accountable. So we really need to look at the role of civil society, which of course is not separate, but is interactive with the public and private sectors. So I have tried to make a very complex picture a little simpler while still being accurate, because as we continue through the quarter, we're going to need to see how the church is responding, has responded, and can respond to this reality. And so we really need to understand it as clearly as possible, regardless of its complexity. So blessings on your process.